So in 1968 in Minnesota, a young chemist named Spencer Silver was working on a polymers for adhesives program in the aerospace industry. He was trying to create a really, really strong adhesive. And he tinkered, as chemists often do, and added too much of a certain reagent to his formula and created a entirely new formulation with a unique molecular structure. It was a low-tack, reusable adhesive, strong enough to cling to objects, but weak enough for sort of a temporary bond. So Spencer was really excited because nobody had ever seen anything like this before. He told his colleagues, he told his boss, and they all said the same thing. They said, we're making stuff for airplanes. It needs to be stickier, not less sticky. So he knew he had something interesting, but he couldn't figure out a practical application for it yet. So he started holding workshops in his company. He started holding seminars and inviting people to come learn about this new innovation that he had developed. A lot of people came to his workshops. He gave these workshops for 5 years, showing people this new innovation. But a lot of people said it was a solution without a problem. But he kept pushing and pushing. For 5 years, he did these presentations. One person who came to one of those presentations, his name was Art Fry. And Art was a product development engineer and also sang in his church choir in St. Paul, Minnesota. Art had a problem because every time he opened his hymn book, his bookmarks would fall out and he would lose his place. And he thought back to the seminar that he attended years earlier and thought, maybe that's a good solution. So he took Spence's low-tack adhesive and he made a bookmark, a sticky bookmark. And it was a perfect solution, except the world market for bookmarks is not that big. How many bookmarks have you ever bought in your life, right? But later on, so the idea kept germinating and sparking more ideas. So later on, he was sending a report to his boss, and he turned, and there was a scrap of it left over from the bookmark project. So he put it on the report and scribbled a note and sent it to his boss, and his boss scribbled a note underneath it. And then another light bulb went off, and he thought, maybe it makes more sense for quick notes rather than bookmarks. And the simple Post-it note was born, sort of. For 3 years, management, they were only going to fund it, they were only going to put resources behind it because they didn't have the machines to make it. And they were only going to fund it if it was commercially viable, right? And there has to be an ROI for these kind of projects, and they had to know that they could sell enough to recoup their investment, and that wasn't even close to proven. But they had printed a bunch and used them internally at 3M Labs. At the labs organization of 3M, Art Fry had created a bunch and given it to the geeks in the labs, and they loved it. So they thought there was something there. They took it to 4 test markets for 3M and just put it in the stores. They allowed customers to buy it, and it bombed. And 3M management patted themselves on the back, and they said, see, we told you there wasn't a market for this. And then they figured out that it's kind of a new thing. They talked to the geeks in the 3M labs, and they figured out that it took a while to understand the practical use case for this new invention. So they did something in 1978 called the Boise Blitz. They realized that the product needed sampling, that they needed to get it in front of people using it, trying to figure out how they would use it, because they saw that internally. So they went to Boise and blanketed Boise, Idaho with free Post-it notes. The entire office supply industry in Boise in 1978. It was a good place to be if you wanted free Post-it notes. 90% of the customers who tried it said they would buy it. And so it sparked from there. So it took 12 years of rejection and pivots and connections and serendipity before Post-it notes were finally a hit. And now they're one of the top 5 best-selling office products in the world, and a $100 million a year product line for 3M. It was also invented during something 3M calls permitted bootlegging. And I don't think there's alcohol involved, but it was their version of Google's 20% time. Google sort of gets credit for the 20% time thing, but it existed many years before at 3M and at HP. So jump ahead to 2000. Pixar was building its new studio in Emeryville, California. The original architecture plan called for 3 different buildings with separate offices for scientists animators, and the executives and everybody else. Now, after what we've seen here the last 2 days, does that sound like a good idea to anyone, right? Let's isolate everyone by function. So Steve Jobs knew that was a bad idea too. And like Scott told us yesterday, work and creativity work better when there's a combination of open and closed space, collaborative space and quiet space for working and thinking. So Steve Jobs designed a huge atrium at Pixar, and he put the meeting rooms and the cafeteria and even the bathrooms all right off of the atrium so that you run into everybody during the course of the day. Because he knew when you run into people, connections happen, collisions happen, and new innovations happen. So he made it impossible for you not to collide with the rest of the company. So interactions like this would happen all the time in the Pixar atrium. As Jonah Lehrer says in his book, Imagine, Jobs wanted there to be mixing. He knew that human friction makes the sparks, and that when you're talking about a creative endeavor that requires people from different cultures to come together, you have to force them to mix, that our natural tendency is to stay isolated, to talk to people who are just like us, who speak our private languages and who understand our problems. But that's a huge mistake, and so Jobs' design was to force people to come together. Now there's a bit of a myth about the bathrooms at Pixar that there was only one. Part of Steve Jobs' master plan was for there to be this one bathroom in the center and everybody came there. Turns out that's not true. There were 8 bathrooms at Pixar, but they were all structured off of this main atrium. 1993 in Boston, Massachusetts, a guy named Tony and his friend got approval to open a pizza business in their dorm in Harvard. And so they ran the business for a little while, and their best customer, a guy named Al, right? A guy named Tony selling pizza, a guy named Al buying it, right? Would sometimes order a large pie to go, and sometimes 2 or 3. And Al was known as the human trash compactor for his huge appetite. But even 2 to 3 pizzas in an evening seemed sort of strange because Al was not that big of a guy. So Tony found out later that what Al was doing was buying the pizzas in the basement, taking them up to the 3rd floor study halls, and selling them off slice by slice. And that is why, to this day, Tony says Alfred Lin became the CFO of Zappos. It was Tony Hsieh and Alfred Lin. 2003, I was flying through the O'Hare Airport. I was working for Accenture, which at the time was the largest consulting firm in the world. And I was in between projects, and I needed another book to read on the second leg of my flight. They were calling for my flight to board, so I quickly ran into the airport bookstore, and I just grabbed the first book that looked interesting, and it happened to be this book, Purple Cow by Seth Godin. So I hopped on the flight, and on that leg of my flight, I burned through the whole book and read the whole thing, and it climbed into my brain and changed the way that I thought about business and marketing and work. And so I thought, great, I'm 4 years into this great career at Accenture. I'm just going to bring a bunch of this awesome, innovative thinking to Accenture. They're going to love this stuff. It's like I found out a secret that somehow they didn't know this was going to be great. Magic plus Accenture, and their tagline was innovation delivered. So I was like, they're going to love this stuff. They didn't. Even though their tagline was innovation delivered, Accenture, unlike 3M, the culture of Accenture is structured for interchangeable people so that they can pick you off of one project and put you onto another project, and you're a robot and you fit and it works. So I got a few things implemented, but my hit rate was like 1 out of 50. So I wasn't getting much traction. And I was in this weird place where I had this good, long, stable, safe job, but I knew I wanted to leave because I'd read all this other stuff. I read the rest of Seth's books, and then I read Clue Train Manifesto, and I knew it was like nights and weekends. I was so much more excited and enthused. I was reading and discovering this entire other world nights and weekends, and then going to my Accenture job and opening Excel and working in 10,000 row Excel requirements sheets and PowerPoint. So in 2008, in November, Seth blogged about an opportunity to study with him. The title of the blog post was called "If You Could Change Your Life," and the first sentence was, "Would you?" And that was like a lightning bolt to me. I had no interaction with Seth. I had just read all his stuff and tried to implement it inside of this aircraft carrier of a company. So the only good thing about failing all those projects at Accenture and handing out books like they were candy was that in January 2009, when I asked to take a leave of absence from Accenture to go study with Seth, they knew at least the name because they're like, oh, that's that guy you won't shut up about. So I left Accenture for 6 months, and I went to study with Seth in his office in Hastings-on-Hudson, north of here. And it was just, a deeper dive of all the stuff he talks about, just learning that. And at the end, I had this decision to make. I had this, in July, I was so excited. I was focused completely during the program, but the end date sort of crept up on me, and I wasn't ready, because at that point I had to choose. Do I go back to Accenture and my comfortable 6-figure salary and move back to San Diego and have health insurance and get a promotion? Or do I do what I knew I wanted to do since 2003, and then had 6 months of Seth in my ear saying, you have to do this, but it was 0 clients, 0 revenue, no health insurance. It was literally starting my career over from scratch. So even though in my heart, I knew it's exactly what I wanted to do, it was still really hard in that moment to start over. I had never gone out on my own before. I'd run right from college, right to Accenture, 10 years. That's all I knew. But I left, and I said, I don't know, I'll figure it out. The biggest thing I thought of was, I could probably always go back, right? If I crash and burn and fail for 6 months. I think we're so scared, and I wish, looking back on it now, I wish that voice would have been louder and said, so you fail for 6 months, you've got savings, you can always go back. And turns out you never do go back. So being a bit of a hacker myself, I thought, how do I get clients? How do I get my first client? And in 2009, after studying with Seth, learning about marketing, learning about social media, I understood Twitter, I understood how businesses could use this stuff, but I didn't know how to get my first client. So a friend told me about this program at Zappos called Zappos Insights. And it's a program where you pay money and you go to Zappos, and Tony and the crew teaches you how they do culture at Zappos, and so that you can take that back to your own company. It was kind of weird to go there as a company of one because I didn't have anyone to bring the culture back to. But in my mind, I thought if any companies that are paying Zappos to learn their culture might also be interested in my social media consulting services. Wrong again. But I did meet Jessica there, and it all comes full circle. The connections matter. I met Jessica. I told Jessica about Seth. Jessica told Seth about the Girl Scouts. Seth said, give me a business plan for what you're going to do to change your life. The business plan involved really fancy cocktails. And then Twitter and email and a crazy lady in Austin. And then she met Brian and became exec director of the New York Tech Meetup and organized this to bring us all here in a big collaborative space using products made by Steve Jobs and barbecuing our sacred cows on Post-it notes. So I want to read this quote from Jason Fried. He says, when you look back on events, it's pretty incredible how things come together. Nothing happens independently. Everything is tied to something before it. Sometimes the links are more obvious than others, but it's healthy to take a few moments and reflect on how many things and people had to come together in order for another thing to happen. You just never know. And so if you look at the new Zappos headquarters in Las Vegas, Tony Hsieh just moved them from Henderson, Nevada, a suburb of Las Vegas, right to the old downtown Las Vegas, and he's completely reinventing the downtown part of Vegas. It's pretty rare when you get a chance to kind of do City 2.0, and he's doing that in Vegas. He's creating a new part of Vegas. So he took a page out of the Steve Jobs playbook at Pixar and is creating this atrium where everyone in Zappos has to go through the atrium. You can't park in the far lot and go through the back door and sneak off to your cubicle because Tony values collisions over convenience. But what does that look like in a world where we don't have office buildings? Like Tony just told us, half the workforce is expected to be independent by 2020. And if you look at some of the books that are coming out and are popular now, this is Jason Fried's new book, Remote, Office Not Required. This book just came out this week. It's called The Year Without Pants, and it's got to be the best book cover of all time. This is by Scott Birkin. It's about a year working at Automatic. Automatic is the parent company of WordPress. WordPress powers 20% of the internet, and their 120 employees work from anywhere in the world, wherever they want. They barely use email, and they launch iterations and improvements to their products all day, every day. So if you have a doubtful boss, it's pretty easy to point to WordPress as an example of somebody who's doing this, doing it right. So I want to get you out of here. I want to leave you with one last story. In October 1927 in Brussels, Belgium, they held a conference called the Solvay Conference. And some of the most amazing scientific minds in history were gathered there. Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Marie Curie, a female who to this day is the only person to win a Nobel Prize in 2 different sciences. 17 of the 29 people at the Solvay Conference were Nobel Prize winners. But the interesting point is, more than half of them won the Nobel Prize after the conference, not before. So the organizer did not just go down a list of Nobel Prize winners and said, let's have a party. They brought together an amazing group of people who connected and made magic. This is a Solvay conference. Look around you. You're all geniuses. So don't let this conference end today. Keep all of these connections going. I'm expecting some Nobel Prizes. Tony, Jenny, all of you. So when you go back to work, I want you to think about how to increase the number of connections and collisions. I want you to think about how to make more sparks that lead to new innovations. I want you to think about how you're going to spread your idea. The ideas, you have notebooks full of ideas from the last 2 days. How are you going to find your art fry? Maybe you reorganize the office for better flow. Maybe you give seminars on your idea. Maybe you can use technology like Podio or MailChimp. Maybe you can help implement a 20% hack day like 3M and HP and Google. Right now is the chance of a lifetime. Don't waste it. Thanks.